On the coldest night of the year, when even the city's lights seemed to shiver, a 6-year-old girl staggered barefoot into Riverside Memorial Hospital, clutching her baby brother in her arms, and what she whispered next shattered a millionaire's guarded heart forever. If stories of healing, redemption, and second chances touch your soul, please subscribe and stay with us until the very last chapter of this journey. The automatic doors parted with a hiss, and winter rushed in like a living thing, snow riding the wind, cold gnawing at the tile. For a heartbeat, the emergency department held its breath. Then a nurse dropped her pen. A resident fumbled the intake forms. A security guard stepped forward and stopped, unsure. Everyone had seen suffering. No one had seen it arrive like this. A tiny child braced against the gale, a bundled infant pressed to her chest, her wet footprints stippling the floor like a trail of commas that refused to become a period. Dr. Rachel Bennett was moving before anyone else. 15 years of emergency medicine had taught her to recognize the tilt of crisis. She crossed the distance in long strides, kneeling to the girl's eye level. "Hey there," she said, voice steady, clinician and mother braided into a single tone. "What's your name?" The child swallowed, throat rasping. "Abby? And your brother?" "Caleb." The name loosened something in her face, as if saying it warmed him. Rachel lifted the corner of the blanket with practiced care. The baby's lips bore the faint bluish stain of cold. His eyelids fluttered in slow blinks. "We're going to help him," she said, rising. "Pediatric hypothermia team, now." The room snapped to. Warmed IV bags were summoned. An infant warming unit was wheeled in. Monitors blinked awake. A nurse gently eased the bundle from Abby's arms, and for a second Abby refused to let go, the desperate animal clutch of someone who had learned the hard mathematics of loss. Then she saw the nurse's hands, saw the steady competence in them, and released her hold by degrees, palms lingering a heartbeat longer than needed. A man in a dark overcoat had been watching from the corridor, the way people watch a thunderhead, with awe, with fear, with the premonition of change. Alexander Reed had come to Riverside Memorial without an entourage, the way he made his rounds when investors weren't looking. Officially, he was there to inspect the rollout of a neonatal filtration upgrade his company had funded. Unofficially, he came when the weather turned cruel. He hated to be home on nights like this. The quiet of the penthouse pressed old memories too close. Now he crossed the threshold and felt his balance shift. He wasn't thinking like a CEO. He wasn't thinking at all. He knelt so that Abby didn't have to look up. The smell of snow clung to her hair. Her knees were mottled red with cold, her toes as pale as candle wax against the tile. "You don't have to let go of me," he said softly, aware that control could be lent like a coat. "Your brother is getting help." Her eyes, hazel, startled, unblinking, flicked from the flurry of activity back to him. "Promise he won't be alone," she whispered, as if the words might break if they touched air too loudly. "Please don't let him be alone." Something inside Alexander tilted and fell. A hospital room 5 winters ago. The hiss of oxygen, the rise and fall of a small chest, the futile cadence of an alarm that had not meant rescue. He had promised then, and grief had made a liar of him. The memory was a blade he carried without scabbard. It bit, even when still. "I give you my word," he said, voice hoarse. "He won't be alone." Relief softened her features not into joy, but into permission. She allowed herself to breathe. A volunteer swept a warm blanket around her shoulders. A nurse slid socks over her feet and coaxed her toward a chair near the trauma bay so she could see the glowing cradle where Caleb now lay beneath the warming unit. She sat bolt upright, small palms flattened on her knees as if posture itself might steady the world. Rachel reappeared, eyes quick, hands steadier than the storm. "Core temp is low, but we're trending up. Vitals responding. We'll keep him under warming protocols and fluids. She turned to Abby. We'll take care of you too. No frostbite that I can see, but you're chilled and dehydrated. Abby nodded without quite hearing. Her attention was soldered to the crib beyond the glass. When Caleb's hand twitched, she leaned forward, as if her body could cross the distance without moving. Alexander took the chair beside hers but angled it so she could keep her view. He did not fill the silence with platitudes. The room had enough noise, the faint ping of monitors, the squeak of rubber soles, the janitor's mop whispering shadows off the floor. Silence, he was learning again, could be a kind of warmth. You have someone we should call? Rachel asked gently, a question that knew too many answers. Abby's fingers tightened on the edges of the blanket. Mama's gone. She swallowed. Dada's gone too. The words came in a careful line, as if each had to be placed somewhere safe before the next could follow. It's just me and Caleb. Rachel's features tightened the way good doctors' faces do when the world behaves like a wound. We'll loop in social services, she said to Alexander, then softened at Abby. And we'll make sure you're together. Alexander noticed the backpack at Abby's feet, purple, scuffed, the nylon frayed where hands had worried it into familiarity. A small stuffed ear peeked from the zipper. He didn't ask about it, not yet. Objects, like people, deserve to be approached on their own terms. Can I sit here? He asked, a guest in his own hospital. She nodded. A beat later, as though the decision had cost her more than she could spare, she added, You can, but you have to listen. I'm listening, he said. Abby didn't offer a full story. Children rarely do on the first try. She offered pieces, each one small enough to carry. The radiator that hissed but never warmed the room, the way she had cupped a bottle in her hands to heat it when the stove was cold, the nights she counted breaths because numbers felt like anchors in the dark. She did not name the man who had left and said he would come back before the snow. She didn't need to. Thin facts sometimes tell the thickest truths. Alexander held those pieces carefully, turning none of them toward pity. Pity is a spotlight. It blinds. What Abby offered required something else. Witness, perhaps, or the kind of attention that lets dignity remain clothed. Across the glass, Caleb's chest rose with marginally easier effort. A nurse adjusted the probe on his tiny foot. The blue faded from his lips as pink returned like a shy dawn. Rachel returned with a paper cup. Warm apple juice, she said. Small sips. Abby obeyed, the steam fogging briefly in front of her face. Mr. Reed, Rachel added sotto voce, we'll need payer authorization for anything not covered and a contact for custody updates. CPS is on the way. Everything for both children goes to my authorization, he said, the language of money feeling like the wrong tool and the only one he had. No limits. Rachel measured him and nodded. She'd known his story. Many in Chicago did. Tonight she seemed to learn his intention. The storm clawed at the windows. A plow's amber light strobed against the glass and disappeared. Somewhere along Lakeshore Drive, a siren wailed and dwindled. Abby finished the juice and tucked her hands back under the blanket, small fists re-emerging only when the crib's monitor chirped and settled. A woman in a cardigan the color of oatmeal appeared at the doorway, snow dampening her hair. Linda Carter, she said, kneeling so Abby wouldn't have to look up. I help families make plans. Abby pressed her lips together. Her hand drifted, unconsciously, instinctively, to Alexander's sleeve, as if to test whether words had weight. I'll be here, he said simply, the promise shaped to fit this new silence. Linda nodded approval without smiles. To Alexander, she murmured, We'll need to verify residence, locate any legal guardians, and ensure the siblings aren't separated. To Abby, she said, We'll ask gentle questions later. For now, you can rest. Rest. The word struck the air like a tentative bird. Abby's eyelids fought it, lost, fluttered. She slumped sideways and then caught herself, pride waking her before sleep could. Alexander slid his folded coat behind her as a cushion, the old ritual surprising him with its muscle memory. He had tucked a different small body against a different armrest once, counting breaths then too. "Mr. Reed?" Rachel's voice again, softer now. "You can go home. We've got them." Home. The elevator that opened into a private foyer. The hush that met him at the door and pressed like a hand against his chest. The framed picture turned face down on the nightstand because looking and not looking both hurt. "I'll stay," he said. Not to be noble, to be true. He sat like that for a long time, watching Abby sleep in the strange posture of children who have learned to keep their shoes near, watching Caleb warm by degrees, watching the storm tire of its own anger. Hours thinned into threads. A volunteer pushed a cart of coloring books past and left one on the chair arm, just in case morning came with crayons. Abby stirred once, twice. The third time she opened her eyes, she did not startle to find him there. "You stayed," she murmured, the words an observation, not a question. "I told you I would." She considered, then turned her face toward the glass, toward Caleb, toward the small machine that spoke in beeps and mercy. "Okay," she said, a verdict delivered without gavel. A quiet settled that felt less like absence and more like room. Room for breath, for decisions, for mornings that might not be measured in cold. Alexander let his shoulders drop a fraction. The air entering his lungs did not cut. Beyond the windows, the city shivered and shone. Inside, a new arithmetic began. One promise kept, 2 children under lights, 3 lives turning, slowly, stubbornly, toward warmth. Snow still pressed against the hospital windows, soft and relentless, muffling the city into silence. The night had stretched thin, yet Alexander Reed hadn't moved from his post near the pediatric bay. Nurses came and went, IV bags were changed, Caleb's cheeks slowly flushed with life. But Alexander sat anchored in his chair, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the siblings as if they might vanish if he dared to blink. Abby had dozed at last, curled sideways under a warmed blanket. Her small frame was taut even in sleep, as if her body had forgotten how to let go. Caleb lay in the crib beyond the glass, steady beeps marking his fragile progress back toward warmth. Alexander leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring through the partition at the baby boy's chest rising and falling. It should have been a relief. It should have been only relief. But instead it split him open. He saw another child, another winter, another room. Lily. She had been 8 years old, full of questions he could never answer quickly enough. She had adored riddles and pancakes, invented elaborate stories for her dolls, and hummed tuneless melodies as she brushed her hair. And then the fever had come like a thief. What began as a cough became pneumonia that spread like fire through her small lungs. He remembered the sound of machines, the blur of white coats, the pediatric pulmonologist explaining cytokine cascades as though science could soften inevitability. Alexander had stayed by her bed, grasping her hand until his fingers ached, promising she would not be alone, promising over and over as if the sheer force of his vow could bend the arc of medicine. It hadn't. And when her chest stilled, when monitors fell to a merciless flat line, he had felt not only grief but failure, failure stamped into his marrow. All his resources, all his hospitals, all his research grants had amounted to nothing. He had been a man who built systems to save lives, yet he couldn't save the one life that mattered most. That was the wound that never closed. Now, as he looked at Caleb, lips dusky but slowly pinking, and at Abby, her face slack in exhausted trust, the old grief surged back with savage clarity. His chest constricted, his breath shallow. He rose abruptly, pacing the small stretch of floor. The tailored control of a boardroom dissolved. What remained was a man cornered by his own ghosts. He pressed his palm against the cold window, watching his reflection blur with Caleb's tiny frame. Dr. Rachel Bennett appeared at his shoulder. "You haven't moved for hours." He didn't look at her. "I can't." "Caleb's responding," she reminded him. "He'll need time, but he's stable. And Abby, she's strong, though she's running on nothing but instinct and courage." Alexander exhaled hard, his voice frayed. "I promised my daughter I wouldn't leave her side. I promised I would protect her. And still, I buried her." Do you know what it does to a man when the one vow that matters most becomes a lie? Rachel's face softened. It makes him believe no promise is worth making again. He turned toward her then, eyes shadowed but lit with something raw. "Until tonight. Until that girl begged me not to let her brother be alone, I can't—" His voice cracked. "I can't break that promise again. Not this time." Rachel studied him, understanding in her gaze. "Then don't. Stay. Fight for them. Maybe keeping your word to these children is how you heal the wound left by the one you couldn't save." Her words landed like a key against a lock that had rusted shut. Hours later, Abby stirred. She rubbed her eyes, the blanket slipping from her shoulder, and looked around until her gaze found Caleb's crib. Relief flickered across her face when she saw the baby breathing steadily. Then she noticed Alexander standing nearby, arms folded, eyes rimmed red from exhaustion but unwavering. "You're still here," she said quietly, half surprised. "I told you I would be." She hesitated. "Grown-ups say things, then they go." His chest tightened. Kneeling so their eyes met, he spoke carefully, each word deliberate. "I've left enough things in my life. I won't leave you. Not you, not Caleb." She studied him, suspicion and longing warring in her gaze. Then, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders eased. "Okay," she whispered. It wasn't trust yet. It was something smaller, but just as precious. The possibility of trust. Later, when Rachel returned to check vitals, Alexander authorized again. Firm, absolute. Every expense, every treatment, every hour of care. Put it under my account. Rachel raised a brow. "You realize what you're taking on?" "Yes." His voice was steady now. "And I'm not asking for the cost, I'm demanding it." She gave a small, approving nod. "Then I'll see that it's done." As dawn bled slowly into the sky, the snow outside softened to flurries. Abby had fallen back asleep, one small hand stretched toward Caleb's crib as though to tether him in dreams. Alexander watched them both, a silent sentinel. And though the wound of Lily still bled, for the first time in years, he felt that maybe, just maybe, it could heal by holding on to the hands of two children who needed him as much as he needed them. The storm had eased, leaving the city under a bruised dawn. Gray light spilled through the hospital windows, turning snowdrifts into dull mounds of ash. Inside Riverside Memorial, the pediatric bay was quieter now, but the hum of machines and the muted shuffle of nurses carried on. Abby sat on the edge of her chair, still wrapped in the heated blanket. Her eyes hadn't left Caleb's crib since the moment she arrived. Each beep of the monitor tethered her to him, proof that he still fought, that she had not failed. Alexander Reed remained close, watching the way she straightened every time Caleb stirred, the way her small fists tightened when footsteps passed too near. He had seen investors guard fortunes with less ferocity than this 6-year-old guarded her brother. It was then he noticed again the backpack at her feet. The faded purple nylon frayed along its edges, straps twisted from overuse. Abby's hand never strayed far from it, fingers brushing the zipper as though to reassure herself it hadn't disappeared. When a nurse stepped in with fresh linens, Abby leaned protectively over the bag. Alexander knelt beside her. "You've carried that everywhere," he said softly. "Is it heavy?" Abby's eyes flicked toward him, cautious. "It's mine." "I don't doubt it," Alexander replied. He kept his voice calm, not pressing, not prying. "Sometimes what we carry tells our story. If you ever want me to listen, I will." For a moment she said nothing, her gaze darting between him and the crib. At last, she loosened her grip. "If I show you, you can't take it away." "I won't," Alexander promised. Slowly, she tugged the zipper open. The sound was small, but in the stillness it seemed to echo. She drew out the first object, a worn photograph. The photo showed a young woman with warm eyes, hair falling over her shoulders, and a child's arms looped around her neck. The edges were bent, the surface dulled by fingerprints, but the love within it was unmistakable. "This is Mama," Abby whispered. Her voice carried reverence, not sorrow. "She used to sing when she brushed my hair. She made pancakes with bananas. Caleb never got to taste them." Alexander swallowed hard. The photograph blurred in his vision. Lily had loved banana pancakes too. He steadied his breath. "She looks like she loved you very much." Abby nodded, stroking the photo before slipping it carefully onto her lap. Next, she pulled out a baby bottle, the plastic cloudy and cracked. Empty. "Sometimes I fill it with water," she said. "Caleb likes it better when it smells like milk. I keep it even when it's empty, so he thinks it's full." The matter-of-fact way she spoke pressed against Alexander's chest. This was ingenuity born not of play, but of desperation. Then came a teddy bear, its fur rubbed threadbare, one ear barely hanging on. Caleb's comfort, no doubt. Abby smoothed its head with careful fingers, as if the bear itself might break. Finally, she brought out a small notebook, its cover bent and peeling. She flipped it open to reveal uneven handwriting, pages scrawled with shaky letters and lists. Numbers lined the margins, words like milk, bread, diapers scratched with check marks or left blank. "I keep track," Abby explained. "Mama said smart people write things down so they don't forget. I wrote so I wouldn't forget what Caleb needed." Alexander turned one page carefully. In crooked letters, she had written, "Day 12. Mama is gone. Don't cry in front of Caleb." Another. Day 15. Too cold. Caleb needs hospital. I will find one. His throat closed. This wasn't just a notebook. It was a ledger of survival, written by a child who should have been learning spelling words and drawing houses with crayons. "You've done more for him than most adults ever could," Alexander said quietly. His hand hovered near the notebook, but he didn't take it. "You've been his sister, his protector, his mother." Her lips trembled. "I just tried to keep him from being too cold. But last night, I wasn't enough." The words cracked his chest open. He leaned closer, his voice thick. "Abby, you were enough. You brought him here. He's alive because of you." She searched his face, looking for any sign of falsehood. For the first time, her shoulders eased slightly. She let the backpack slide onto his knees. Not surrender, not trust without limits, just a small offering. Alexander held it carefully, as though the contents were holy. In truth, they were. They were the story of a little girl carrying a burden no child should, yet doing so with ferocity and love. Abby leaned back, eyelids drooping with exhaustion. If Mama were here, she'd say Caleb needs someone strong. Alexander looked at the notebook, at the tiny, uneven letters spelling out bravery. Then she'd be right, he said. When Abby's head finally rested against the chair and her breathing deepened, Alexander remained, the purple backpack on his lap. He felt the weight of it, far heavier than its scraps suggested. It carried not just survival, but a testament. And he knew, as surely as he knew his own name, that he could not, would not, let it be the last chapter of these children's story. The snow had slowed, but the world outside Riverside Memorial still wore winter's bruise. Alexander had not slept. He couldn't. Not after holding Abby's purple backpack in his hands, reading the crooked handwriting that told a story no child should have to write. By mid-morning, social services had arranged for a welfare check at the address Abby had whispered, an old house in a place called Carter's Mill, on the far western edge of Chicago's sprawl. It had once been a mill town, but decades of neglect had left it hollow, its brick shells sagging, its roads cratered, its silence loud. Linda Carter, the social worker, met Alexander in the hospital lobby. She carried a clipboard and the weary efficiency of someone who had seen too many children slip between cracks. "You don't need to come," she told him as they stepped out into the icy air. "I do," Alexander answered simply. Her eyes narrowed, studying him, not the CEO in the pressed overcoat, but the man beneath. "Then prepare yourself. Places like this don't forgive." The drive was long, the snow thinning to slush on the roads. Alexander's car, sleek and immaculate, looked alien rolling past boarded windows and shuttered shops. The sign for Carter's Mill leaned on one hinge, the paint scoured by years of wind. The house they sought sat at the end of a cracked lane. Its windows were dark, curtains shredded. A broken mailbox slumped in the yard. The front steps sagged as though they might collapse beneath a child's weight. Inside, the air was colder than the street. The smell of mildew clung to everything. The refrigerator door hung ajar, its interior barren except for a mold-caked jar. Cabinet doors gaped open like mouths with missing teeth. Linda walked through with quiet precision, taking notes. No food, no heat, no utilities connected. This isn't just neglect, it's abandonment. Alexander's chest tightened. He moved through the rooms, each one a testament to survival scraped from nothing. A mattress with springs exposed, a blanket crumpled in the corner, crayons broken to nubs scattered across the floor. Then, in a back room, he saw it. On the wall, faint and uneven, were drawings in crayon. A sun with shaky rays, a stick figure holding a baby. Next to it, larger letters spelled out, Day 15, Caleb Cold, we go find hospital. Alexander reached out, fingertips hovering over the waxy lines. He imagined Abby kneeling here, shivering but determined, pressing her story into plaster because paper was running out. Something broke in him then, not like shattering glass, but like ice splitting to reveal running water beneath. He turned to Linda, his voice ragged. "They can't come back here. Not ever." Linda's face was grave. "With what we've seen, the court will not return them to this residence. The question is, where they go next." Alexander straightened, a steel edge threading through his exhaustion. "With me." Linda studied him for a long moment. "That's not how the system works." "Then we'll make it work," Alexander said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "I'll hire counsel, file for emergency guardianship, whatever it takes. They will not be lost in the system. Not these two." She closed her notebook. "You know you're talking about more than charity. This is years. A lifetime." "I know," Alexander said. His hand brushed the wall again, the crooked words etched in crayon. But I've already lost one child. I won't lose them too. When they stepped back outside, the cold hit harder. Alexander looked once more at the sagging house. Its silence felt different now, not just decay, but defeat. He imagined Abby walking out the door with Caleb on her hip, trudging through snow in search of hope. He clenched his jaw. That house saw them fight to survive. But it won't be their story's end. I'll see to that. As they drove away, the mill town shrank in the rearview mirror. But the image of the crayon drawing burned itself into Alexander's mind. It was not just evidence. It was a vow left by a child who refused to give up. And now, it was his vow, too. The police station in the west side of Chicago smelled of burnt coffee and damp uniforms. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, washing every surface in a sterile, unflattering glare. Alexander Reed sat in the corner of the interrogation room, jaw clenched, hands folded so tightly that his knuckles whitened. He had asked to be present, and because of his influence and perhaps his insistence, the officers allowed it. The door opened. 2 officers guided in a man whose posture sagged beneath the weight of neglect and drink. His clothes hung loose, the stench of stale alcohol clinging to him. Thomas Rodas, the stepfather, the man who had walked away and left Abby and Caleb to freeze. Thomas dropped into the chair opposite the detective, scratching his stubbled chin. His eyes were bloodshot, half defiant, half indifferent. When they flicked to Alexander, they narrowed with suspicion. "What's he doing here?" Thomas slurred. Alexander's voice was low, steady, but thrumming with restrained fire. "I'm the man who found the children you abandoned." Thomas gave a dry laugh, bitter as cheap whiskey. "Abandoned? They were never mine. Their mother dragged them into my life, not me." Alexander leaned forward, his tone tightening. "She's dead. And instead of stepping up, you left a 6-year-old to carry an infant through a snowstorm. Do you even understand what could have happened?" Thomas shrugged, leaning back. "Not my blood. Not my problem. I never asked to play daddy. You want to waste your money on them? That's on you." The words sliced through the air like glass. For a split second, Alexander surged forward, fists tightening as if he might cross the table. He saw Lily's face in his mind, the small hand he couldn't save. He saw Abby's exhausted eyes, Caleb's blue lips. Every instinct screamed for him to strike. But he didn't. He stopped himself, his muscles trembling with restraint. Violence would give Thomas an excuse, and Alexander refused to give this man the dignity of control. The detective cleared his throat. "Mr. Rodas, your negligence is criminal. Abandonment, endangerment. We've got enough evidence to press charges. You'll be seeing a courtroom soon." Thomas snorted. "Good. Maybe they'll finally take those brats off my hands." Alexander's voice dropped, calm and lethal. "You're wrong. No one will take them. They're with me now, and I will fight with everything I have to make sure you never see them again." For the first time, Thomas's bravado faltered. His smirk twitched. He shifted in his chair, uneasy under Alexander's steady gaze. The detective leaned forward, cutting in. "Mr. Reed, I think we've heard enough." Alexander stood slowly, adjusting his coat with deliberate precision, every movement a statement of control. He looked at Thomas one final time. "You never wanted to be a father, fine, but know this, those children will never carry your name again. They deserve better, and they will have it." He left the room before his restraint broke. Outside the interrogation wing, Linda Carter was waiting. "How bad was it?" she asked quietly. "Bad enough," Alexander muttered. "But it doesn't matter. I've heard all I need to. He's forfeited every right." Linda nodded. The next step is legal. Emergency guardianship, then a full petition to terminate his parental rights. It won't be easy, but with your resources and with what we saw at Carter's Mill, it's possible. Not possible, Alexander corrected, his eyes hard with resolve. Necessary. For a moment he let himself exhale. The rage still pulsed beneath his ribs, but it had transformed into purpose. He wasn't just reacting to loss anymore. He was fighting for life, for Abby, for Caleb. As he stepped out into the frigid afternoon, the snow had stopped falling. The air was sharp, clean, bracing. Alexander drew it deep into his lungs. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time in years, he welcomed the fight. The city's rhythms had resumed their steady pulse, but for Alexander Reed, time moved differently now. His days were measured not by quarterly reports or boardroom votes, but by the fragile cadence of two children breathing in the next room. It had been a week since the confrontation with Thomas Rhodes. A week since Alexander left the police station with rage still smoldering in his chest, tempered only by the sight of Abby's small hand clutching Caleb's mittened one. The hearings loomed ahead, but for the moment, they were together, and that was enough. The penthouse was changing. Once it had been a monument to silence, chrome, glass, and marble where echoes had lived longer than voices. Now, scattered toys littered the pristine floors. Crayon drawings decorated the refrigerator. The purple backpack sat like a sentinel at the foot of Abby's bed. Caleb's babble echoed down the hallway. One evening, Alexander stood by the window overlooking Lake Michigan. The city glowed beneath him, but his eyes weren't on the skyline. They were on Abby, curled up on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders, sketching in her notebook while Caleb tugged at the teddy bear beside her. "Can I show you something?" she asked suddenly, holding up a drawing. He walked over, crouching beside her. 3 figures stood beneath a lopsided sun, one tall, 2 small, arms stretching wide. Above them, in uneven handwriting, she had written, "Family." The word lodged in his throat. His chest tightened, a familiar ache blooming where grief lived. He swallowed, forcing steadiness into his voice. "It's beautiful, Abby." She studied his face, serious beyond her years. "But it can't be real unless you stay." The words cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal, deeper than any loss. He wanted to answer immediately. But something inside him, something raw and unhealed, made him pause. He looked at her drawing again, then set it gently on the coffee table. "I need to tell you about someone," he said, voice low. Abby tilted her head, curious. "I had a little girl once. Her name was Lily. She was 8 years old. She had a laugh that filled every corner of this place. She liked pancakes, even when I burned them, and she used to draw pictures like you do. But one winter, she got sick. We did everything, but—" His voice broke. He pressed a hand against his mouth, gathering himself. "I lost her." Silence. Caleb babbled softly, oblivious, chewing on the bear's ear, Abby's eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on Alexander. "You mean she died?" He nodded, the word like glass in his throat. "Yes." Abby wrapped her arms tighter around the blanket. "Do you still miss her?" "Every single day." His voice cracked. "I miss her laugh, her drawings. I miss tucking her in and hearing her call me Daddy." He stared at the floor. "I promised her I'd never leave her side, and then I had to watch her go anyway." For a long time, Abby said nothing. Then she set her drawing down, crawled across the couch, and put her small hand on his. "My mama said angels whisper things," she said softly. Maybe Lily whispered us to you. So you wouldn't be lonely anymore. The tears he had held back for years spilled before he could stop them. He covered his face with his free hand, shoulders shaking. Not the controlled grief he had shown the world at Lily's funeral, but the raw sobs of a father whose wound had never healed. Abby didn't move her hand. She sat still, steady, like an anchor holding him in the storm. When he finally lifted his head, eyes wet and voice ragged, she whispered, "You didn't fail her. You loved her. That's not failing." The words struck him like light breaking through cloud. He pulled her gently into his arms, holding her as if she were the last fragile piece of truth in the world. Caleb squawked, climbing into his lap too, and suddenly he was holding them both, the children who weren't his by blood, but who had become his by something stronger. He pressed his cheek against Abby's hair. "You saved me," he whispered. "Both of you did." She looked up at him, her eyes solemn, but softer than before. "Then don't leave. Promise." He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I promise." Not ever. Later that night, after Abby and Caleb had drifted to sleep, Alexander stood once more by the great window. But the reflection staring back at him wasn't the man he had been for 5 years, the hollowed-out CEO grieving in silence. It was a man holding the weight of the past and the hope of a future. He placed a hand against the glass, whispering into the city lights, "Lily, I'll never stop missing you. But I think you wanted this for me, for them. Thank you for sending them." And for the first time in years, the words didn't cut. They healed. The snow had melted into slush along Chicago's streets, but inside the Cook County Courthouse, the air was thick with tension. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters hovered by the doors, and the hum of fluorescent lights seemed louder than usual. For Alexander Reed, this day was unlike any boardroom duel he had ever faced. He wasn't defending a company or negotiating a billion-dollar deal. He was fighting for 2 children, one 6 years old with eyes too old for her years, and a baby boy who barely survived the winter because of his sister's courage. The case was called State of Illinois versus Thomas Rhodes. Petition to terminate custodial rights and assign guardianship of minors Abigail Hayes and Caleb Hayes. The gavel cracked, calling the room to order. The judge, stern behind silver-framed glasses, scanned the room before settling her eyes on the defendant's table. Thomas Rhodes sat slouched, a suit borrowed and wrinkled, his jaw unshaven. He looked more like a man on trial for petty theft than someone claiming guardianship of 2 fragile children. His sneer lingered as though he believed the system could still bend his way. Alexander sat straight at the petitioner's table, Margaret Fielding, his lead attorney, beside him. Behind them, Abby sat clutching Caleb's blanket, her feet not reaching the floor. She didn't look at Thomas. She stared only at Alexander, as if measuring whether he would keep his promise in this unfamiliar arena. The state's attorney presented the case first. Photographs of Carter's mill, the rotting refrigerator, the cracked windows patched with tape. Medical reports detailing Caleb's hypothermia, Abby's malnutrition. Abby's notebook entered as evidence, a diary of survival, each page bearing the weight of days no child should have carried. The entries were read aloud. Day 12, Mama is gone. Don't cry in front of Caleb. Day 15, too cold. Caleb needs hospital. I will find one. The courtroom fell silent. Even the court reporter paused, her fingers trembling on the keys. Thomas scoffed. Kids write all kinds of things. Doesn't mean it's true. The judge's eyes narrowed. Mr. Rhodes, you will remain silent until called upon. Margaret rose next. Calm, precise, formidable. Your Honor, My client, Mr. Alexander Reed, has assumed full responsibility for Abigail and Caleb Hayes since the night they arrived at Riverside Memorial. He has provided immediate medical care, housing, and stability. He has demonstrated intent to preserve their sibling bond, something the Department of Child and Family Services deems critical in placement. Mr. Reed is not seeking financial advantage or publicity, only guardianship. The judge studied Alexander. Mr. Reed approached the bench. He rose, buttoning his suit jacket. The room shifted, every gaze following him. He was used to this, the focus, the scrutiny, but this time his hands felt heavier. Mr. Reed, the judge began, you are a man of great means. Why involve yourself so deeply in this case? Alexander's voice was steady but thick with emotion. Because 5 years ago, I lost a daughter to illness. I stood in a hospital room much like the one where I found Abigail and Caleb. I promised my little girl I'd never leave her, and yet I had to watch her slip away. I couldn't save her. But when these two came into my life, I swore I would not fail them. They may not be my blood, but they are my children now, in every way that matters. A hush swept through the room. Even the reporters stopped scribbling. The judge nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Reed. You may be seated. Then came the defense. Thomas's attorney, a man slick with false charm, argued that his client had been under stress, that the children had never been formally abandoned, that poverty, not neglect, was the real issue. My client is willing to make amends. He is their stepfather, and the law presumes family first. Thomas smirked, leaning back in his chair. See? They can't just take what's mine. Alexander's jaw clenched. He wanted to shout that children were not property, not bargaining chips. But he held still, knowing the moment that mattered most was still ahead. At last, the judge turned to Abby. Abigail, she said gently, I need to ask you something important. You've been very brave. Can you tell me where you feel safe? Who do you want to live with? The room froze. Every heartbeat seemed to pause. Abby's small hands twisted Caleb's blanket in her lap. She glanced once at Thomas, her shoulders shrinking as if remembering cold nights and broken promises. Then her eyes lifted, finding Alexander's steady gaze. He didn't signal her. He didn't mouth the words. He only looked back with quiet certainty, a man who had sworn not to leave. Abby took a shaky breath. Her voice was small but clear enough to echo across the chamber. Mr. Reed keeps his word. He promised he wouldn't leave. I believe him. I want to stay with him. And I want Caleb, too. We belong together. For a moment, silence blanketed the courtroom. Then the gavel struck once, sharp and final. The court recognizes the testimony of the minor child, the judge said firmly. Temporary guardianship of Abigail and Caleb Hayes is granted to Mr. Alexander Reed pending final review. Custodial rights of Mr. Rodas are hereby suspended. Thomas exploded. You can't do this, they're mine! You're all against me! The bailiff moved swiftly, restraining him as he shouted. The judge's gavel hammered again. Order. Mr. Rodas, you are in contempt. Remove him. As Thomas was dragged from the room, still spewing curses, Alexander turned toward Abby. She was already looking at him, her eyes glistening but steady. For the first time, she smiled. Not wide, not carefree, but small and sure. It was enough. Outside, the courthouse steps were slick with melting snow. Reporters called out questions. Cameras flashed. Alexander ignored them. His focus was only on Abby, who reached for his hand, and on Caleb, warm against Linda Carter's shoulder. Linda looked at him as they descended the steps. Temporary guardianship is just the beginning. There will be home studies, evaluations, more hearings. This isn't over. Alexander tightened his grip on Abby's hand. I don't care how long it takes. I'll walk every step. And as the cold wind whipped across the plaza, he felt something steady within him, a purpose stronger than any he had ever known. He had won the first battle. Now he would fight until Abby and Caleb were his in name as well as in heart. Chicago was still thawing from winter when Abby and Caleb left the hospital behind. Snow clung stubbornly to the gutters along Michigan Avenue, but sunlight glinted on the frozen surface of Lake Michigan, promising that spring was near. For the first time in weeks, Abby wasn't wearing a hospital gown or a borrowed coat. She had on a new blue jacket Alexander had bought her, with bright yellow buttons she couldn't stop fastening and unfastening. Caleb, snug in a stroller, wore a wool hat that kept slipping over his eyes. The elevator ride to the top of Alexander Reed's penthouse tower was silent, except for Caleb's little hums and Abby's nervous fidgeting. She stared at the mirrored walls, as if they might swallow her whole. When the elevator chimed open, she stepped out cautiously, her small hand clutching the handle of her purple backpack like a lifeline. The penthouse sprawled in gleaming silence, glass walls framing the lake, steel counters, floors polished to a shine that made Abby pause before stepping. It was a world of order, untouched by laughter, too clean to feel alive. Abby whispered, "It's too shiny." Alexander knelt to her level, his voice softened, stripped of the CEO edge. "Then we'll fix that." The first thing Abby did was unpack her backpack. She placed Caleb's teddy bear on the leather couch, where it looked oddly small against the wide cushions. She pinned her mother's worn photo to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a Chicago Bulls logo that Alexander dug out of a drawer. Then she tucked her notebook into the corner of the bookshelf. The room shifted, just slightly, from sterile to lived in. The next day, Alexander returned from errands with bags that looked strangely out of place in his hands. Toys, blankets, pajamas with rocket ships for Caleb, and a box of crayons. He laid them out awkwardly on the kitchen counter. Abby raised an eyebrow. "You bought these?" "Yes," Alexander admitted. "I thought you might like them." "Not from the hospital?" she pressed. "No." He smiled faintly. "From me." Her suspicion lingered, but she picked up the crayons and began to draw. Within minutes, the refrigerator door was covered with uneven pictures, stick figures labeled Abby, Caleb, Daddy Reed. Alexander stood frozen, staring at the word Daddy. The ache in his chest spread, sharp and sweet. The transformation of the penthouse happened slowly, like snow melting. Abby left her shoes by the door but not neatly aligned. Caleb's blocks scattered across the living room floor, waiting for someone's unsuspecting foot. The silence that had haunted the place was broken by giggles, by Caleb's babbles, by Abby's small voice reading books out loud as she pointed to pictures. One Saturday morning, Alexander tried cooking pancakes. The first batch burned. The second batch stuck to the skillet, but Abby bit into a lopsided one and declared, "Better than Thomas's food." She grinned, and for the first time in years, Alexander laughed, a real laugh that shook loose something he hadn't let himself feel. He bought Abby a small desk for her drawings. She taped a giant sheet of paper to the fridge one night and scrawled 3 big stick figures under a sun. In uneven handwriting, she labeled it Family. Alexander felt his throat close as he looked at it. He knelt beside her, his voice rough. "Abby, that's beautiful." "You said you wouldn't leave," she replied matter-of-factly. "So I put you in the picture." "I won't," he promised, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Never. Yet not all moments were easy. Some nights Abby still woke screaming, clutching Caleb and whispering that the cold was coming back. Some mornings, she eyed Alexander as if testing whether he was still there, as if waiting for him to vanish like Thomas had. Each time, Alexander answered with patience. He would kneel, level his eyes with hers, and say the same words. "I'm here." I'm not leaving. Gradually, she began to believe. One evening, as the city lights blinked on below, Abby curled beside Alexander on the couch while Caleb played with blocks at their feet. She studied the skyline for a long time before speaking. "This feels different," she murmured. Alexander glanced at her. "Different how?" "Not like Carter's mill. Not like the hospital. It feels—" She hesitated, searching for the word. "Like home, but not the kind you leave." Alexander's chest tightened. He turned fully toward her. "That's what I want it to be. A home you never have to leave." Abby looked at him as if measuring the weight of his words. Finally, she nodded, satisfied. "Okay, but you better not mess it up." "I'll do my best," Alexander said, smiling through the lump in his throat. The penthouse no longer felt like a mausoleum. It was still imperfect. Pancakes were burned, toys cluttered the floor, and fingerprints smudged the glass walls. But for the first time in 5 years, Alexander didn't see emptiness when he looked around. He saw Abby drawing at her desk, Caleb stacking blocks with messy determination, and the word family taped to his refrigerator like a declaration of war against loneliness. It was a beginning, not polished, not flawless, but real. The city glowed in twilight, Lake Michigan, a sheet of silver stretching to the horizon. Inside the penthouse, laughter had begun to take root. Abby's drawings decorated the refrigerator, Caleb's babbles echoed across the hardwood, and the smell of pancakes lingered from breakfast. But not every night was free of ghosts. Alexander found Abby sitting cross-legged on the rug one evening, carefully building a tower of blocks for Caleb to knock over. She hummed softly, a tune that sounded too much like a lullaby. When Caleb toppled the tower, she laughed, a quick, bright sound. But then her face turned serious. She looked up at Alexander, who was watching from the couch. "Did you have a kid before us?" The question pierced like ice water. For a moment, Alexander forgot how to breathe. His jaw tightened. "Yes," he said quietly. "I had a daughter. Her name was Lily." Abby nodded as though she had already guessed. "She's the reason you look sad when you think no one's watching." He swallowed, stunned by her perception. "You're right," he admitted. "I lost her. She got very sick. I promised her I'd never leave her side. I kept that promise, but I couldn't stop her from leaving me." The words trembled out of him, carrying 5 years of silence. His throat closed, but Abby's gaze was steady, waiting. "I built hospitals, research labs, programs," he continued, voice hoarse. "I thought if I fixed the world, I could fix the hole in my heart. But nothing brought her back. And for years I thought I didn't deserve another family." Abby crawled closer. Dragging Caleb's teddy bear in one hand, she set it in his lap, as though the worn toy might help carry the weight. Then she slipped her small hand into his. "I don't think Lily would want you to be alone," she whispered. "Maybe she asked God to send us." The dam broke. Tears Alexander had buried beneath boardrooms and headlines spilled freely now. He pulled Abby into his arms, holding her as tightly as he dared. Caleb, sensing the change in the air, toddled over and pressed his head against Alexander's knee. Alexander bowed his head, voice breaking. "You've saved me. Both of you. I thought I was finished, but you've given me a second chance." Abby leaned her cheek against his chest. "You saved us too. We both did it." The words, so simple and absolute, soothed a wound years in the making. For the first time, Alexander felt that grief and healing could exist together, not canceling each other out, but weaving into something stronger. Later that night, after Caleb drifted to sleep, Alexander stood by the window. Abby joined him, her hand still wrapped around his. The city's lights stretched below like constellations on Earth. Do you miss her every day? Abby asked softly. Yes, Alexander whispered, and I always will. But now, when I think of her, it doesn't feel like a weight pressing me down. It feels like she's watching over us. Abby tilted her head. Then maybe she'll be happy I called you Daddy. His chest tightened, but this time with joy. He bent down, kissed the top of her head, and whispered, She would be very happy. And as the city pulsed with light, Alexander realized that his wound, though reopened, was no longer just pain. It was a doorway through which Abby and Caleb had entered, bringing him back to life. Sunday morning dawned golden across the lake, sunlight spilling through the glass walls of the penthouse. The air smelled of butter and batter, warm and comforting. In the kitchen, Alexander Reed stood at the stove with a spatula in hand, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly mussed, no longer the polished CEO of Reed Health Systems, but simply a man trying to get pancakes right for the two children who had made his home breathe again. The first pancake flipped awkwardly, landing half-folded. Alexander sighed, shaking his head. Another one for the crispy pile. Abby sat at the counter in her pajamas, legs swinging freely. She giggled, covering her mouth. That one looks like a shoe. Alexander grinned. A gourmet shoe, then. Caleb, strapped in his high chair, babbled excitedly, banging his spoon against the tray like a drum. Da-da! The word froze Alexander in place. His hand trembled on the spatula. He turned, hardly daring to believe. Caleb's little face lit up with joy as he repeated it, louder this time. Da-da! Tears welled instantly in Alexander's eyes. He dropped the spatula, crossed the room in 2 strides, and scooped Caleb up from his chair. The boy squealed with delight, tiny fists gripping Alexander's shirt. Say it again, Alexander whispered, voice breaking. Da-da! Caleb crowed, as if announcing it to the world. Alexander buried his face in the boy's neck, laughter and tears mingling in a sound that shook the silence that had haunted him for years. His chest, once hollow, now felt full, aching, but with joy. Abby slid off her stool and came closer, watching carefully. Her expression was thoughtful, almost solemn. So, does that mean you're really our dad now? Alexander set Caleb back in the high chair and knelt in front of Abby so they were eye to eye. Yes, I'm really your dad now. The court signed everything last week. It's official. Abby blinked. For a moment, her face was unreadable, as though she was measuring the truth in his words. Then she gave a small nod. Okay, then we're a family. Not perfect, but real. Alexander smiled through tears. Not perfect, he agreed, but whole. They sat down to breakfast together. The pancakes were uneven, some too dark, some too doughy, but Abby drizzled syrup over hers with great ceremony, declaring them better than Thomas's food by 100 times. Caleb smeared his across his face, laughing as Alexander tried to clean him up. Above the refrigerator, Abby had taped her newest drawing, 3 stick figures under a sun, arms stretched wide. Across the top, she had written in shaky letters, Family Forever. Alexander stared at it, the lump in his throat rising again. Once, his penthouse had been a tomb of memories, filled with silence and grief. Now it was alive with crayons on the walls, toys on the floor, laughter echoing off glass. For years he had believed he was a man broken by loss. But here, with Abby tugging at his sleeve and Caleb calling him Dada, he understood the truth. He hadn't been broken. He had been waiting. Waiting for the 2 children who needed him as much as he needed them. Later that day, Abby and Caleb built a fort from blankets and pillows in the living room. Alexander crawled inside with them, laughing as Abby declared it their castle. Caleb clapped happily, his curls bouncing as he toppled block towers. "Daddy," Abby said suddenly, the word rolling naturally now. "Can we stay here forever?" Alexander pulled both children close, his heart swelling as he answered, "Forever, and longer if I can." The afternoon sun cast golden light through the fort's folds, illuminating three figures huddled together, an imperfect family stitched by grief and healed by love. That night, after the children were asleep, Alexander stood by the window overlooking the glittering city. For years, he had looked at this view and seen only emptiness. Now, he pressed his palm to the glass, whispering into the sky, "Lily, I'll never stop loving you. But today, I know you wanted this for me. For them. Thank you for sending me Abby and Caleb." The city lights blurred through his tears. But this time, they weren't the tears of a man broken by loss. They were the tears of a father who had finally found his way home. Thank you for staying with us until the very last chapter of this journey, from loss to courage to healing. If Abby, Caleb, and Alexander's story touched your heart, please subscribe for more stories of hope, love, and second chances. Together, let's keep building a world where no child feels alone and every broken heart can find its way home.